Okay, welcome everyone. I know some of you are just tuning in, but of course, to honor the ones of you who are punctual, welcome to this session on NIS2 in connection to some of the information and business continuity standards that I usually work with. What I'm going to say a bit about here is the connection, the interplay between the NIS2 directive and its requirements in connection with working with a management system for either business continuity or one affiliated with the 27001 series working with information security. I also want to mention to all of you that we'll structure this, I'm just showing you it here, that we will structure this in a way that will allow for you, of course, to present questions, but we will do that afterwards, meaning that I will be talking here for some 30 minutes or so, so it's kind of a condensed session, and then I will allow for 15 minutes at the end where I will review some of the questions that I find in the chat, and hopefully we can work our ways through most of them. So the structure for this half an hour presentation is just to give you the NIS2 background. What does this entail? The Network and Information Security Directive. What's the gist of it in a condensed version? And afterwards, take the directive and put it into the context of a management system, specifically 27001 for information security and 22301 for business continuity. And then at the end, for some 15 minutes, I will hopefully be able to work my way through the questions you might have. I'm sitting here in not so sunny Copenhagen in Denmark, another place in Europe where we embark upon the process of course, implementing the NIS2 directive. We're a bit belated in Denmark, and so are other countries in Europe. I myself work as a trainer instructor for 27001 for some of these management standards. I also work as a consultant, and so that's mostly that's been my background for some 10 years. Also taking part in the international development of these standards. Well, let's get started. So just to give you the background, we're looking into a Network and Information Security Directive, actually the second version, an updated, revitalized and improved directive being presented by the EU. The whole idea here is to look into how can we protect our digital infrastructure, the one that supports the critical services such as railways, power grids, food supply, waste, general communication, and so forth. It's all about making sure that we in Europe reach a common high level of cybersecurity. And for those of you who are in your daily life working with information security, you'll be pleased to know that the principle of availability is, of course, at play here. But that is what we focus on, maintaining the availability of the society's critical services. So that is at the heart of the NIS2 directive. One might say that that reality kind of caught up on the directive, given the situation, particularly in Europe. We now have a war happening in Ukraine. So we're looking at alterations right now in the threat landscape. I'm showing to you here a slide which ties to our neighboring country here in Denmark, namely Sweden. Sweden recently joined NATO. But still, Sweden is extremely concerned about how even the public, but also, of course, the governmental institutions tackle the threat landscape that they see right now. I'm taking some references here to Carlis Neretniks, which is an ex-rector of the Swedish Defense College. What he presented here, I think, ties very, very much into what NIS2 is all about. So a conventional war is probably not just going to start by tanks rolling across the border. It's going to start by cut of communications lines. It's going to start by lack of electricity supply. So the attacker's path ties fully into what NIS2 is all about. I also want to mention here before we get started that we're looking at a directive. Some of you may have, for some years, been working with the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, with its focus on personal data, of course, which was a regulation, so a binding act directly applicable to each country. What we're looking at here is something that sets a goal for every single member state. And now, most countries are now awaiting the member states' governments to present the actual legislation. So you might say that NIS2 is setting a minimum set of requirements, and the way in which the approach in which this is being dealt with is a national matter. Who's covered by this? Well, I'm not going to go into all the details because there are rules and there are exceptions to the rules on who will be hit, who will be covered, who will be part of the scope of the NIS2 directive. But just putting it in general terms, organizations, named entities within the directive, finding themselves part of some of the annexes within the NIS2 directive, will see themselves as being part of this. Well, there is a threshold here, so it would need to be organizations of a certain size, as mentioned here in the second point. So organizations with more than 50 employees and with some specific annual turnover, annual balance sheet will become part of this. So there is a threshold here, and there are certainly also exceptions to that threshold, exceptions that also tie into DNS providers, cloud providers. And if your organization forms part of national security or defense, law enforcement, then you're also not covered by the NIS2. So which sectors are at play then? Well, organizations, as I mentioned here, of a certain size, and then the ones that are presented within the NIS2 directive, which means it's a whole list of various sectors that are at play here. The most critical sectors are presented on the left side here, everything from energy down to space. We've had some additions to the NIS1 directive on this one with wastewater, public administration. And what I'm presenting on the right side are the ones that are less essential but still important. So these are the sectors that you will find listed in the Annex 1 and the Annex 2. And to be an essential entity, the term that's being used by the NIS2, you would have to be a company of a certain size. So you would have to be what we would, at least in Denmark, call a larger organization, one that also has a turnover at a higher level, whereas the important entities will be the ones you have on the right-hand side, where other rules will apply. So there is this distinction, of course, in NIS2. You may be covered, but there may be different rules at play depending on whether your organization is an essential as part of these of the highly critical sectors, the 11 ones I'm presenting here, with a certain size requirement to the organization. Otherwise, if you're not at that level, you will fall under the important entities, which also goes for the sectors I present here, the 7 sectors on the right side. So, and there's a lot of exceptions. Some of you will definitely know them, I'm sure. Exceptions to these rules as to how they're looked upon, but those are kind of the broad picture here. Another broad picture for you, or should I say the scope of NIS2, which I think is also important just to put some emphasis on. Sorry, I'm working a bit fast here. So there are some specifics on what forms part of the systems that are essential to delivering a service. And the reason why I'm attaching some importance to this is that once an organization finds themselves as part of being an essential entity or an important entity, they still need to look at, so what services inside our organizations are actually at play? What are we looking at here? What communication lines, what PLCs, if we're working with that element, what devices, and what data is being processed by point number 1 and 2. So an HR department may not be within the scope. Just to give you an example. Okay, so that was the really condensed introduction to NIS2, and I'm also sure that most of you have enjoyed to hear me reiterate the requirements of NIS2, rather to look into how adopting, using, leveraging from management standards might make your journey more successful when adhering to the requirements of the directive. I'm mentioning 2 standards here, and there's a reason for that. I'm mentioning 2 requirement standards here. So these are certifiable standards. Business continuity standard 22,301. So this one deals with ensuring the robustness, ensuring the ability to continue to deliver services at a certain level. It sets the requirements for what we call a business continuity management system. So the abbreviation here, BCMS, is the management system to provide us with business continuity. Does it overlap with the other one on the right side, the information security standard? Certainly it does, since part of the critical assets that we look at when we figure out what are the critical activities that we're running, we look at our different assets. We find people, we find IT, we find information. We may find buildings and equipment as well. So information forms part of business assets, something that is worth protecting. On the other hand, we have information security, making sure that we maintain, for instance, confidentiality of our data. So this is the standard that sets the requirements for another management system, the one known as an information security management system. Does it overlap with business continuity? Well, those of you working with 27001 will know it certainly does. So there are control areas that tie into business continuity. Why is that so? Well, simply from the fact that if you undergo a crisis, we still need to maintain availability of information. So they certainly overlap, these two, but they form part of what is critical and what is at the heart of NIS 2. Let's dig a bit more into the two, just for you to get a more detailed glimpse of it. So what's at play? Well, if you're working with a business continuity management system according to 22,301, you'll be met with distinct requirements on how you analyze your organization. So the one of the strong benefits of working with the business continuity standard in regard to NIS 2 is your ability to be able to pinpoint what are critical activities, analyze what are the critical assets that form part of these processes. So conducting business impact analysis will help the organization understand what is critical. And of course, fueling in legislation here becomes ever so more important. As for any other management standard, you will be met with the requirement of conducting risk assessment. Those of you working with a management standard will know the frustration of the management standard not setting the exact level of controls. So for any management standard, there is no silver bullet. It says, look into your context, figure out what risks do you need to tackle in order to maintain business continuity. And this standard will also require for you to, on top of your business impact analysis, to build your strategies, build your plans in order to bring the organization at the level where it needs to be if you're hit by a catastrophe. So some of what ties into this is, of course, also pinpointing how old can our backup be, the recoverable point objective. If we're at a crisis situation, do we need hot site? Do we need warm sites? What practice do we embark upon? What is the recovery time objective, and so on. Now, working with 27001, we have a focus on the information. So this is a distinct focus on the information assets, and a focus that is not just tied to the availability of information in a crisis situation, but also one that ties into confidentiality. We want to ensure that no one who's not authenticated, authorized to access data does so. We want to ensure the data is fully correct. We want to ensure that we have all the data in one place at the exact right time. The integrity part, correctness, the full amount of data that we need. So we have an interplay here between CIA, we would call it. And again, as I mentioned here, it's all about conducting risk assessments against the risk appetite, the risk willingness of the organization to figure out what we need to do. And some of you who've already read NIS 2 will know that running risk assessments become ever so more important in the context of the critical processes that are within the scope of the NIS 2 requirements. Now, I think one can invest some time on this one in the screen right now, because this is This is maybe a bit of a small font sizes here on some of the letters. I hope it's possible for you to see them. I will of course share the slides with PCB, and hopefully they can share the PDF version with you afterwards. But just to let you know, running a management system, bringing NIS2 into the game, well, not to pin down NIS2 or be negligible about it, but it's just another piece of legislation that we fuel into our management system. So what I'm trying to show you here is that if an organization is already working with 27,001, working with 22,301, they will already have an input-output approach to how they conduct their business continuity and their information security. And on the input side, the NIS2 directive is just another piece of legislation in much the same way that the GDPR was. It's something that ties into what we need to do in terms of bringing the business onwards to protecting our information. And so what we do when we work with the management system is that we look at the applicable legislation. We look at changes in legislation, and now we have NIS2 coming up, but we also look at what our organization, of course, is set up to do. The goals, the vision, the value of what we want to provide services for, maybe services in a public sector, maybe products in a private sector. We look at stakeholders, we look at suppliers, we look at customers, we look at internal stakeholders, board of directors. We look at another piece of legislation, the contracts that we want to adhere to. And all of this will be deciding on what we embark on. It will decide for us on how do we actually tackle risk? What do we need to plan? What do we need to implement? What do we need to evaluate? What do we need to act upon? So it will decide how we orchestrate our processes. So we have the Deming cycle in the middle here, the activities that we would need to bring about, the activities that we will assess and constantly improve to make sure that we get the information security and the business continuity at the level where we need to be. And of course, this management system, and I think for those of you working with a management standard, you'll be able to put the clauses of a management standard next to each of these points. The input side, that's the context of the organizations, that would be chapter 4. Planning within the input-output model here, that would be chapter 6. Chapter 8 will be the implementation, that's the do part, again of the Deming cycle. The check part will be chapter 9, and the act side, the continuously improving the management system, that will be chapter 10. And the two chapters I haven't mentioned of the management standard is the one that ties to management leadership, that's chapter 5, and the one that ties to resources, chapter 7. So essentially, for an organization already working with a management system, we have now the NIS2 directive, which requires for us to do some tweaks and turns on the processes we already have. I will show you some of the processes, some that tie to management, some that tie to risk, and some that ties to the controls that we decide to implement, the controls that maintain or modifies risk. So yeah, let's take a look at a couple of requirements within the directive, which can be tackled in the context of a management standard. Again, with a focus on protecting information security, protecting the business, providing continuity in our processes. I'm going to look into 3 things. Of course, this is indeed a boot camp, and we have another 10 minutes of my presentation left here, roughly. So I'm going to invest some time in the management requirements of the directive. I'm going to look a bit into the requirements tied to managing cybersecurity risks. And then I'm going to look into some of the reporting obligations that some of you may also be very familiar with. So I'm not going to look into of course, the responsibilities of the member state. I'm fairly sure that most of you on this call will want to look more into what is at play for my organization, or maybe at play for an organization that you support as a consultant. So what are the requirements for top management? Well, if you look into Article 20 of the NIS2 directive, we will see that there are some specific points mentioned here. We might see that for those of you working with management standards, you'll see that the requirements you have in management standards are being specified and stretched to some degree. So top management, board of directors, executive committee, will be responsible for the compliance with the obligations of the entity. They need to determine strategy and risk appetite. They need to educate themselves. I think something fairly new when we look into management standards. They need to educate themselves. Also need to ensure that education is available to other members of their organization who might need this. And they need to assess the cybersecurity risk. And I guess these two requirements, they kind of they have a connection in the sense that you cannot understand and assess cybersecurity risk if you're not educated to do so. And they need to supervise the implementation of controls, which also fuels into having them educated. So some distinct and some strengthened requirements into what we see in a management standard. If we look into the 27001 standard for information security, if we look into the business continuity standard, 22,301, and if we're already working with them, we already have top management on board. Why do we do so? Well, they're already adhering to the requirements tied to allocating resources, making sure that the business strategy is tied to business continuity and to information security. They have formulated policies on business continuity and information security because that is a requirement of each of the standards. They've ensured that there is a setup, organizational setup, authorities being given across the organization. I'm writing powers here. I think authority is a better word for the requirement of the standard. And then, most importantly, they're also being met by a requirement of reviewing this management system, making sure that it remains applicable, that it remains suitable to its needs, adequate, effective. So you might say that the requirements coming from these two now put some extra emphasis on some of these matters. So top management, who might meet biannually, will need to educate themselves. They will need to not just fast improve our risk management strategy, risk treatment plan. They need to invest some time in understanding the efficiency of it. So what we're actually doing is strengthening some of the requirements for a top management that's already invested in either or information security, business continuity. What I'm not digging into here is, of course, some of what you will know is fairly helpful in getting top management involved, and namely the liability elements within Article 32. It must be the ones that tie into that leadership as part of essential entities might actually be replaced. They might be set somewhere else for a certain period of time. That there are some sanction possibilities here that are far more harsh than what we've seen before. Not just the fines, lower level than the GDPR, but something else that ties to personal liability of top management. And that is, of course, something that hopefully gives us their ears and their time in order for us to make sure that they also do the training they need. What else? Well, it would be highly unrealistic to work through all of these. But as some of you know, the NIS 2 directive actually puts some very specific wording on controls. Now, from my being a trainer for standards, I think there's a bit of a mix-up of what is risk and what is controls, but it really doesn't matter. Article 21 is fairly clear on the fact that we need a risk approach. Again, we know it's from the GDPR. Now it's a risk approach that ties to the services we deliver for the society, not for the data subject, of course. And then the directive goes even further and lists a couple of minimum requirements for controls. And I think this is a place where any organization should invest a lot of its time right now. From a Danish context, we now have the sense that the national legislation that will arrive a bit belated, that will be put into force early next year, will definitely reflect what's listed here. It will be very close to what we're seeing here. And so what we get to understand here is that if we want to have the right level of security, if we want to be able to say that we are tackling risk in the right way, we need to invest time in human resource security. We need to look into policies and procedures related to risk. We need to look into network security, business continuity is at play here, incident handling, and so forth. So if you're not already, as an organization, looking into these control areas, there is definitely a small mountain to climb. if you're working with a management standard, if we were to leverage from what we have in management standards, I would certainly, well, firstly, I would say any management standard, and so this also goes for 22,301, it goes for 27,001, will require us to have a risk management process in place. So if you're already working with a management standard, you already have a methodology, you have roles at play, you're already looking into likelihood, you're looking into consequence, so you have a setup that you can work from when conducting risk assessments tied to your critical processes. What you will also have if you're working with 27,001 is a reflection on the same control areas that we found in Article 21. So if you're working with 27,001, you'll be pleased to know that there is a full overlap of what has been mentioned in Article 21 and the controls you will know as Annex A in 27,001. Now, what I've tried to do here is quite a complex slide, and it's difficult to work through all of it. But I've mentioned in the flower here, so to speak, each leaf represents the control areas mentioned in Article 21 that you saw before. And then I've listed a numbering which reflects the control numbers in Annex A. You will also find them in the supporting guidance standard on controls 27,002. So the idea is, of course, to already look into what have we done with these control areas when we are working with management system for information security. If there are areas where we've deselected a lot of requirements or where we are not mature enough, certainly this will be an area to look into when adhering to the requirements of NIS 2. And again, all of this is of course done risk-based, and there is a caveat to this because of course national legislations can heighten the requirements, adjust the requirements to specific sectors. So there are some reservations to this. And then finally, the third point I wanted to make is that there is a requirement now, a harshened requirement on reporting obligation, harshened or strengthened when compared to, for instance, the GDPR, where there's reporting requirements, other things equal 72 hours. We're strengthening the requirements here in terms of fast, speedy notification of the relevant authority or computer security incident response team at play for a specific sector. So within a day's time, we need to report on what would be considered a significant incident. And I want to emphasize this, of course, also goes the other way, that the authority will be able to play ball and respond within the same timely manner. So the reporting obligations here are quite harsh. It really requires us to be very, very precise on how we communicate. It's kind of a 1, 2, 3 stepping here, 24 hours, the fast, speedy, short notification of what has happened. Significant cyber threats will be mentioned, and then a more in-depth report after 3 days, within 3 days, I should say, and then an additional 30 days for the full report on root cause and so forth. So how does this tie into any of the standards? Well, I don't have any slide on this, but when you're working with any of the management standards, firstly, you're working with pinpointing non-conformities, you're working with deviations, you will be working to some degree with incident event reporting. Those are controls within 27,001. And so there are additional areas where you will look at the NIS 2 requirement and say, good, we will need to strengthen the way we respond now. Firstly, we will need to look at the processes that deliver the critical services for society, and we'll need to figure out who do we need on board, maybe even external supporting organizations in order to adhere to these reporting obligations for the services we deliver. So again, an overlap in the way the standards are organized. And so it's not wrong to say that if you're already working with the business continuity standard 22,301, if you're already adhering to the requirements of 27,001, not just the control set, but also the processes related to risk, related to management review, then you're certainly at a higher level in terms of maturity, and then the process going forward will undoubtedly be much easier for your organization. the slide I was about to just mention it to is, of course, that those of you who work with information security will know that there are guidance standards that can support us here. And I'm just mentioning 3 of the, should I say, usual suspects that might help us here. 27002, those of you working with the requirement standard, 27001 will know this one, because we're not really being successful in implementing an information security management system if we don't know what's in the guidance standard 27002. It simply unfolds the annex in 27001. So it gives us guidance to the controls that we see in these two Article 21. I've also mentioned the guidance standard 27005 on risk management. Since this is so important to have the risk-based approach to what we do, there is certainly some leverage in digging into 27005. And last but not least, there are a series of incident management standards, 27035, which you might say unfold some of the controls that are already listed in 27001. So these are also some of the standards. And of course, this was half an hour, quite a tour de force for most of you, I'm sure. I also want to mention that there is a reason why PCB themselves conduct a 4-day implementation course on this. There is a lot to be said when working with the NIS 2 directive, also in the context of management standards. Now what I will do now, since we've reached 3:30 at least in the time zone where I'm sitting, is to look a bit into the chat that I have, because I know that there will be questions shared with me here. Yeah, so I'm seeing some questions now, so that's wonderful. I'll just extend this a bit if I'm able to do so it's a bit more easy for me to see all of them. Yeah, well, it should be fine. So yeah, one panelist question here. I hope it's the first one I'm taking. Yeah, should be fine. What are the key differences in cybersecurity compliance needs between the Nordics and other regions? Well, I'll have to give a really vague answer here, since so I'm of course working in I'm working out the Nordics. I'm based in Copenhagen. Most of my customers belong to the Nordic sector. Most of them are here in Denmark. So I'm not familiar with the specific member state requirements. I know that, for instance, in Denmark, governmental institutions have to adhere here to a certain level of technical minimum requirements. I know that they also need to adhere to a self-assessment approach. So this will vary across the region, certainly. If I were to tie something else to this, I know that what will be, of course, different for regions now, which of course is of concern both for me and others, is that the member states themselves are, of course, now presenting the legislation, telling everyone what needs to be done, but there is some delay to this, and so of course there is a concern that it will take a bit longer before every member state are ready also to run the auditing practices that needs to be in place for each sector, and so forth. So again, I'm not familiar with the national differences between the regions on cybersecurity compliance, and I'm sure that it will be in much the same way that it also worked for the GDPR, that some countries will have a steeper journey than others, I'm sure. Maybe one that also relates to digital maturity, where some countries might find themselves in a tougher spot, and also organizations as well. I'm digging into more questions here. What role does collaboration between public and private sectors play in achieving cybersecurity compliance in the Nordics or Denmark? Well, it's now I decided not to dig too much into this, because I wanted, of course, to say something about the overlapping between the standards and organizations trying to bring compliance the NIS2 directive in place. But this is a vital requirement of the NIS2, and one that has been enhanced thoroughly within the NIS2 directive. On the one side, we have organizations who find themselves covered within the Annex A and 2 of the NIS directive, and hence are now embarking on the journey to become compliant with the requirements. On the other hand, we have sectors in Denmark that are also trying to bring themselves up to speed, because in order, for instance, to be able to tackle notifications on incidents, we would have to have a 24-hour situation in place for various sectors. Now again, this can be divided into specific sectors. So the tele industry can do one thing, cybersecurity specific to the defense will do something else. Now defense not covered by the NIS2, but let's say energy sector, it can be divided, or it can happen, which I think to a large degree is going to happen in Denmark. We're going to see the current cybersecurity unit covering various sectors that are maybe not so mature, because they already have in place a 24-hour service. But I think that there's a steep climb for a lot of sectors. I know the energy sector for one, which is very likely to deal with this in a sector approach. So we would have a specific a computer security incident response team tied to the energy sector. They will need to be provided with resources, expertise, most importantly, the ability to respond in a timely manner. That will require some resources. But this is absolutely vital, and also because there is a requirement for member states, of course, to bring this information fairly detailed to the EU in order for us to understand what's going on regionally. The third question, I think that was the one I'm at here. How does the NIS2 directive specifically impact cybersecurity practices in Denmark? Do you also have any insights into? Well, what it does is that for those of us consultants or cybersecurity experts who've talked a lot about the importance of investing in cybersecurity hygiene, making sure you have a good process for onboarding new employees, making sure that you're using multi-factor authentication, making sure you have segmentation of networks and so forth. The Article 21 that I presented to you is specifying why this is important. So when organizations have been met with a suggestion or a hint saying it might be a good practice to do so, NIS2 is going to enforce a lot of these areas. It's going to make it absolutely vital for organizations within health sector, within research areas, within food supply, whomever is covered by this, the annexes of the NIS2, they will find themselves at a place now where it's not just a considered good practice, it's simply a minimum requirement that they can show what they're doing. And I think that is absolutely vital. That there is now a specification on certain areas, backup areas tied to the awareness, situational awareness of the organization, and so forth. Yeah, and some other questions here. Can you, and of course I need to read them, I think I've maybe missed a bit. Can you provide insights into how the Danish organizations are adapting to meet the NIS2 directive requirements? I think we said a bit about considering the unique challenges within the country. Yeah, I think most countries have unique challenges, and I think that the unique challenge in Denmark is perhaps one that ties to the fact that fairly small country, 5.4 million, I think we are, and most of the companies are considered smaller organizations, right? So with less than 250 employees, that's what we're kind of built upon. And so, and there's certainly an element saying size matters in terms of the cybersecurity hygiene, no doubt about it. There are variations between sectors. In Denmark, the insurance, the finance sector is the most mature. And then you have other sectors which are certainly trailing behind. And I think so. The biggest challenge I think in Denmark is for experts, for the relevant ministries in their sector to present to small organizations what this means, what this translates into. There's no doubt about that. This is indeed a challenge in a country where most companies are fairly small. No doubt about it. But again, there are variations to the maturity level of certain sectors. No doubt about that thing. And I also think that what will really be at the heart of whether one succeeds is how the different sectors make sure to work together in terms of sharing information, sharing best practices on how controls are being used. Energy sector will of course require a whole different set of controls than others. There's a reason why the 27000 series have specific sector-specific standards for the energy sector, for the tele industry, for the health sector. There are unique elements in place. There are old SCADA systems which cannot easily adapt to the best practices of 2024. So that is a challenge. And I think that also goes for elsewhere. Some more questions tied to of course the context of Denmark, the resources or support networks that are available. Well, firstly, there is of course, I mentioned before, we have a Center for Cybersecurity that will bring in guidance, and guidance will come from the organizations that may or may not be responsible for a specific critical sector. Secondly, we have websites that will support both municipalities and governmental institutions, private people, even so for cybersecurity matters, and small organizations. So we have some initiatives that have been made. And I also think it's important to say that we've had cyber and information security strategies for some time now. For 10 years, we're at I think the third cybersecurity strategy, but that has been mostly tied to governmental institutions. Yeah, what network, what are available? But there are various, of course, private networks. There are also public sector networks that are in play. I'm sure it makes no sense to name them here, but there are also some private standards at play that you can work with that ties into some of this. Yeah, and I think I'm at the end of this, and I'm just going to look into whether we have some 2 minutes left here. If there's something else that I want to mention, I think that in order to I think it's important to say that from a Danish perspective, the journey on information and cybersecurity has been one where for the public sector, focus has been tied to the governmental institutions with the first information security, cyber and information security strategies. It's hopefully being broadened. It seems to be the case for municipalities also with the NIS2 coming in, which has huge implications, because when we look at municipalities in Denmark, that's a place where the maturity, especially for the small municipalities, is not so high. And then there are some private schemes that tie into using standards. And now organizations may find themselves in a place where they want to get certified against the standard. You'll have auditing companies, of course, delivering their reports, but then you also have some private scheme solutions at play, which specifies requirements and make it more easier for smaller companies to get a certain stamp. So there are some of those at play, but I think again for the broad audience here, which is regionally based, I think that's what I want to mention. And so I'm also closing in on 3:45 on my watch here. I want to thank everyone who listened in. I know this was a fast glimpse of how the management standards connect to the NIS2 requirements, but I want to thank everyone for, of course, for participating and also for your questions along the way. Thank you so much, and have a great day.